What if the deadliest weapon in Iran's entire arsenal was never a missile, never a jet, but a single ship disguised as ordinary cargo, floating in plain sight for years before anyone realized what it truly was? By the time the world understood what that ship really carried, it was already sinking. And the story of how it got there and how it disappeared is one most people never got to hear. Before we go any further, tap that like button because this story took years to build in the shadows and less than 72 hours to erase completely. Subscribe so you catch every part of what comes next. And share this with someone who still thinks modern wars are fought only with jets and tanks, because this one proves otherwise. Now, let's get into it. To understand why this ship mattered so much, you first need to understand the corner of the world it was sitting in. On Iran's southern coast, right beside the Strait of Hormuz, sits a port that has quietly become one of the most watched patches of coastline on the planet. That strait is barely wide enough to be called a strait at all, yet a staggering share of the entire world's oil passes through it every single day. Whoever controls the waters near that opening holds a kind of leverage that has nothing to do with the size of their economy and everything to do with geography. For years, satellites passed over that port again and again, and to anyone glancing at the pictures, nothing looked out of place. Container ships came and went. Stacks of cargo sat in long, ordinary rows, the same as any working harbor anywhere in the world. Fishing boats drifted past. Patrol craft moved in and out. It looked like nothing more than the normal rhythm of a busy coastline. But one of those ships was not what it appeared to be. Underneath the paint, underneath the stacked containers, underneath years of careful disguise, engineers had quietly turned an ordinary vessel into something else entirely. A floating weapons platform built to look like nothing at all. This was not thrown together in a rush. It took years of planning, years of construction, years of testing, all built around a single goal: to hide in plain sight for as long as possible. To understand why Iran went to such extreme lengths, you have to understand the problem it had been wrestling with for decades. Years of crushing sanctions had made it almost impossible for Iran to buy modern warships or build a real, full-sized navy of its own. There was no realistic way to compete with a superpower ship or missile for missile. So instead of trying, Iran built something different: small, fast boats. Coastal missile batteries, sea mines scattered along vital shipping lanes, drones launched from the shore. The idea was simple: make yourself unpredictable, make yourself hard to target, and make yourself expensive to fight, even without a fleet of proper warships. But that approach had one obvious weakness. Everything was tied to the coastline. A speedboat stationed near the port cannot threaten anything 1,000 miles away. A missile battery bolted to the shore cannot move once the enemy knows exactly where it sits. Iran wanted more than that. It wanted reach, the kind of reach that normally only comes from real warships, but without giving up the cheap, hard-to-detect nature of its strategy. So its military planners came up with an idea that was equal parts clever and reckless. Instead of building new warships from scratch, something its sanctioned industry could barely manage, engineers took an ordinary commercial vessel, originally built for nothing more than hauling cargo, and quietly rebuilt it from the inside out. Once the work was finished, it stretched well over 200 meters long, displacing tens of thousands of tons. From a distance, from a satellite photo, from the deck of a passing tanker, it looked like nothing more than an oversized cargo ship. That was exactly the story Iran wanted the world to believe. It was only half true. Hidden beneath that surface story was the real purpose of the vessel. Engineers had built missile launchers disguised as ordinary shipping containers, sitting right out in the open on deck, indistinguishable from the thousands of identical boxes moving through the Gulf every single day. Inside those disguised boxes sat medium-range ballistic missiles, weapons capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. Underneath a coat of paint and a stack of cargo, Iran had quietly built a mobile missile platform, one that could sail into international waters and strike far beyond its own coastline without any warning at all. This was not just a theory sitting on paper somewhere. During a large-scale military exercise, Iran actually launched a ballistic missile from one of those hidden container silos aboard that very ship. Officials called it a breakthrough, the first time the force had successfully fired a long-range missile directly from a vessel at sea. The message behind it was unmistakable. Iran now had a way to threaten distant targets from the water, without depending only on fixed sites on land that could be located and destroyed with a single strike. That ship carried more than missiles. Air defense systems, cruise missiles, radar, and electronic warfare equipment all sat hidden somewhere inside its disguised hull. In effect, it was an entire arsenal wearing the shape of an everyday commercial vessel. Picture what that actually looked like from the outside. A harbor pilot guiding a routine tanker past the port would have seen exactly what he expected to see. Steel boxes stacked in neat rows, Cranes swinging cargo back and forth. Nothing that would make anyone reach for a radio. That is the entire point of disguise. It does not need to fool an expert staring at classified imagery for hours. It only needs to fool the thousands of ordinary eyes that pass by it every single day, because those are the eyes that matter most when you're trying to hide something for years rather than weeks. None of this came out of nowhere. Iran had tried hiding weapons inside civilian-looking ships before, and in one earlier and painful case, it had already lost that gamble. A different converted cargo vessel, stationed off a nearby coastline, was believed by analysts to be functioning as a floating support base for Allied forces in the region. That ship was struck in an operation widely attributed to a rival nation, and explosives were later confirmed to have been planted directly on its hull. Instead of walking away from the idea after that loss, Iran seemed to take a different lesson from it entirely. Build bigger, hide the weapons more deeply, and most importantly, never put everything into a single ship again. That lesson led directly to a second vessel, even more ambitious than the first. Engineers converted another commercial hull into something Iran eventually unveiled as an entirely new class of vessel. Where the first ship hid missiles, this one hid something even bigger, an entire air wing. It was commissioned in a formal ceremony at the same southern port, displacing close to 42,000 tons, making it, according to analysts tracking the program, the largest vessel to ever serve in that branch of Iran's forces. Officials claimed it could sail close to 20,000 nautical miles without refueling, remain at sea for up to a year at a time, and carry dozens of drones alongside fast attack boats. It reportedly carried its own anti-ship missiles, light cannons, intelligence-gathering equipment, and even the ability to launch small underwater drones. It had crew quarters, a small hospital, and training spaces built for long deployments far from home waters. To military analysts watching from outside, this was genuinely remarkable. Turning an ordinary container ship into something resembling a drone carrier was an incredibly cheap alternative to building a real aircraft carrier, and more than one country was reportedly paying close attention to see whether the concept could actually work. Together, these two ships represented two halves of the same ambition. One was a hidden missile launcher wearing the disguise of cargo. The other was a hidden airbase wearing the disguise of a container ship. Both were based at the very same port. Both gave Iran something it had never really had before, the ability to project power far beyond its own coastline while looking from the outside like nothing more than ordinary maritime traffic passing through a crowded shipping lane. And within roughly a year of both becoming fully operational, they would be destroyed within days of each other. Here is where the story turns, and where you start to see just how fragile that clever disguise really was. In the final week of a winter that had already been tense for months, everything changed almost overnight. A targeted strike killed several of Iran's most senior political and military leaders, and within hours, a coordinated military campaign began, hitting targets across the country in a burst of speed that gave Iranian commanders almost no time to react. The stated goals were direct: destroy Iran's missile arsenal, dismantle its navy, and cut off its ability to threaten the region from the sea. On the very first day, wave after wave of aircraft struck air defense systems, missile sites, and military infrastructure in cities across the country. Iran responded almost immediately, firing missiles and drones, not only at its main rival, but towards several other nations in the region, warning that it would keep defending itself for as long as the strikes continued. But before the first missile of that counterattack had even left the ground, the opposing forces had already identified their highest value naval targets, and both of those disguised ships sat right at the very top of the list. The drone-carrying ship was struck within hours of the campaign's opening moments, and reportedly sustained critical damage before it began sinking. Satellite images later showed the missile-hiding ship destroyed at its own anchorage during those very same opening strikes. Officials confirmed the destruction of both vessels within days of one another, framing the losses as a serious blow to Iran's broader strategy of disguising military power inside cheap, converted commercial hulls. Days later, footage surfaced, showing the aftermath: a massive vessel drifting without power, burning and clearly beyond repair. A senior commander compared its size to an aircraft carrier from an earlier era and made the point plainly. The goal was not only to destroy what Iran currently had floating on the water, but to break its ability to quietly rebuild anything like it again anytime soon. In the chaos of those first days, a strange side story broke out that tells you a lot about how fragile the truth becomes once a real conflict begins. State media claimed that an enemy aircraft carrier had been sunk using ballistic missiles, presented as revenge for the strike on its leadership. Officials on the other side moved quickly to shut that claim down, stating clearly that no such carrier had been touched at all, and that the only carrier actually struck in this entire campaign was Iran's own disguised drone ship. It is a useful reminder. For anyone following a conflict like this one, wartime claims from any side deserve careful scrutiny before they get repeated as fact. If a story like this is opening your eyes to how differently modern wars are actually fought, do something small for me right now. Pause for a second, hit that like button. And if you have a theory about which country might be hiding something similar right now, drop it in the comments, because I want to see what you think before I tell you what comes next. The port that had once hidden Iran's most advanced secret ships quickly became the center of a much wider naval campaign. Within days, officials confirmed that roughly 20 Iranian naval vessels had been sunk or critically damaged, including a submarine, multiple smaller warships, and a large support ship set ablaze at its own pier. Separately, another Iranian vessel was struck by a torpedo fired from a submarine and sank off a distant coastline, with most of its crew never recovered. Independent trackers monitoring the wider campaign estimated that more than 30 Iranian naval vessels were damaged or destroyed within the first 2 weeks alone. What is confirmed directly, though, is simple and clear. Iran's most advanced, most expensively engineered ships were hit first, and they were hit hard. So why does the word irreplaceable actually belong in this story rather than being just a dramatic way of describing a loss? It comes down to exactly what these two ships really were. This was not some mass-produced patrol boat that any shipyard could rebuild in a matter of months. These were two individually converted vessels, each one requiring years of specialized engineering, each one representing a strategy that had taken the better part of a decade to quietly develop. According to naval commanders, the drone-carrying ship alone took more than 2 years to convert from an ordinary cargo vessel into a functioning military platform, and it had been in active service for barely a year before it was destroyed. Analysts noted that no confirmed combat missions had even been documented from its deck before it went down. The hidden missile launcher aboard the other ship had only been publicly demonstrated once in that single live-fire exercise, less than 2 years before the ship itself was destroyed. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. This was never a factory line where you order a replacement part and wait a few weeks. Every stage of building a ship like this had to happen quietly, away from satellites, away from foreign intelligence agencies, away from anyone who might notice unusual activity at a commercial shipyard. Engineers had to source a suitable hull, strip it down completely, design a disguise convincing enough to fool trained analysts staring at satellite images for months at a time, and then test weapon systems without ever giving away what the ship actually was. That is not a project you rush. And it is definitely not a project you repeat overnight, especially now that every shipyard, every port, and every unusual movement inside the country is being watched far more closely than it ever was before. Rebuilding either of these capabilities from nothing, under wartime sanctions and constant pressure, is a completely different challenge than simply replacing a lost patrol boat off an assembly line. And there is another layer to this that rarely gets mentioned. It is not only the steel and the missiles that were lost. It is the specific engineers, welders, and technicians who spent years learning how to build this exact kind of disguise. People whose knowledge cannot simply be downloaded or purchased from another country. Losing the ships mattered. Losing the years of accumulated quiet expertise behind them may end up mattering even more, because expertise like that does not rebuild itself on any predictable timeline. It is also worth being honest about what these strikes did not achieve, because an honest telling of the story includes its limits, not just its scale. Losing these two ships did not end Iran's broader ability to disguise weapons inside ordinary-looking vessels. Iran still had other converted ships built around the same underlying idea, including a converted tanker that had previously made long-distance deployments as far as the Atlantic Ocean. The concept survived, even though its two most advanced examples did not. This is exactly the kind of detail that separates a shallow retelling of this story from a real understanding of it. A lot of coverage treated these strikes as simply 2 more lines in a long list of destroyed military targets. But these ships were not ordinary targets. They represented a strategic bet made years earlier, a bet that disguise and patience could buy the kind of naval reach that money and industry could not. When these exact ships were prioritized in the opening hours of the war, it was not just about removing weapons from the board. It was a direct attack on the idea behind Iran's entire naval strategy, the belief that hiding in plain sight was safer than building in the open. There is a symbolic weight here too, and it is not only emotional, it is strategic. Destroying these ships did more than remove 2 vessels from Iran's order of battle. It stripped away platforms specifically built to extend Iran's reach beyond its own coastal waters, platforms meant to complicate the picture for anyone watching the region, and platforms designed to keep operating, even if Iran's land-based systems came under separate attack. The story did not end in those first chaotic days, and understanding what happened afterward matters just as much as understanding the opening strikes, because the underlying conflict never actually settled into a lasting peace. Weeks later, Iran agreed to reopen the strait as part of a temporary arrangement reached after additional strikes and mounting pressure, a deal meant to restore oil exports and commercial shipping that had dropped dramatically during the fighting. That calm did not last long. In the months that followed, further strikes were announced near the same port, targeting missile launch sites and boats believed to be planting sea mines. Iranian forces launched missile, drone, and small boat attacks on warships passing through the strait, and additional strikes followed on nearby military sites. Iran, in turn, accused the other side of violating an existing truce, claiming strikes had hit an oil tanker and other vessels it described as civilian. Between those larger flashpoints, the strait itself became its own quiet, ongoing battleground, separate from the bigger exchanges between governments. Cargo ships were attacked with gunfire and rocket-propelled grenades. Vessels were damaged in unexplained incidents along the coastline. Ships ran aground under murky circumstances. None of it made the same kind of headlines as the opening days of the war, but all of it showed that the fight around this narrow, critical stretch of water never actually paused. It simply dropped to a lower, harder, to track intensity, aim less at warships and more at ordinary commercial vessels caught in the middle. It is worth pausing here to think about who actually pays the price for a strategy like this once the shooting starts. It is not just the naval commanders who designed these disguised ships, and it is not just the political leaders who approved the war. It is the ordinary crew members on cargo ships passing through the strait every single day, people with no connection to any military decision, who now have to sail through waters where a warning shot, a stray missile, or a misidentified vessel could end their voyage in seconds. It is the insurance companies raising premiums on every ship willing to risk the passage. It is the sailors on tankers who now check the news before every shift, wondering whether today is the day their route becomes a target. A war fought through disguise and ambiguity does not stay contained to the two sides doing the fighting. It spreads outward, into every ship, every port, and every family waiting for someone to come home safely. If this story has made you rethink how modern wars are actually fought, this next part matters even more. So stick around, and while you're here, tap share and send this to someone who still pictures naval warfare as nothing more than two gray warships facing off in open water, because this conflict proves that picture is badly outdated. Months later, the conflict flared again, with Iran formally announcing the closure of the strait entirely after firing a warning shot at a vessel it accused of taking an unauthorized route. Forces on the other side responded with more strikes, while publicly insisting the strait remained open despite Iran's announcement. Diplomatic efforts, including a regional proposal to fully reopen shipping through the strait, tried to calm the situation, but Iran's own negotiating team could not secure approval back home to accept it. As of the most recent reporting available, the situation remains tense and unresolved, with no formal peace talks confirmed to be underway, even as reports suggested quiet back-channel communication had been attempted through regional intermediaries. Oil prices, meanwhile, climbed and stayed elevated. A blunt reminder that a conflict centered around a handful of ports in a single narrow strait can ripple outward into the entire global economy almost overnight. Analysts tracking the region continued watching a list of unresolved questions: whether other armed groups allied with Iran would join the fighting, whether earlier understandings between the two main rivals would hold, and whether the fragile lines of communication running between the opposing governments could survive each new incident without collapsing completely. It is worth stepping back and asking why this particular port became the center of an entire war rather than any other location along the coastline. The answer comes down to geography. This port sits right beside the narrowest strategic choke point in the entire region, controlling access to the strait through which a massive share of the world's oil moves every single day. For decades, it had functioned as the home base for Iran's most capable and most experimental ships, the exact place where its most advanced vessels were built, converted, tested, and stationed, precisely because of how close it sits to that choke point. That is exactly why this port was treated as a priority target from the very first hours of the campaign, rather than something to deal with later. Every major vessel destroyed in those opening days either called this port home or was operating nearby when it was hit. Removing Iran's naval capability, there was never just about running up a number of sunk ships. It was about denying Iran the ability to threaten one of the most economically important waterways on the planet, at least for as long as the campaign lasted. That underlying logic explains why, months later, the fight over the strait reignited in almost the exact same form. The closures, the warning shots, the renewed threats of blockade. Even after the opening strikes wiped out much of Iran's most advanced and most expensive naval hardware, the geography itself never changed. Iran does not need a fully intact, technologically advanced navy to threaten shipping through this strait. It mainly needs mines, coastal missile batteries, and the willingness to use them, all of which are far cheaper and far faster to rebuild than a converted, purpose-built expeditionary ship. That is a large part of why this conflict, even after such a devastating opening blow against Iran's most prized vessels, never actually settled into a lasting ceasefire, and why the strait is still being watched nervously right now. There is a bigger lesson hiding inside this whole sequence of events, one that goes far beyond Iran and this particular war. For decades, military planners around the world assumed that raw firepower and expensive hardware decided who controlled the seas. This story tells a very different version of that same lesson. A country with almost no ability to build modern warships still managed to threaten one of the most valuable waterways on Earth, not through brute strength, but through disguise, patience, and geography. It did not need to defeat a stronger navy in open battle. It only needed to make the cost of using that strait uncertain enough that oil traders, insurance companies, and shipping firms around the world started to feel it in their own numbers. That is a very different kind of power than the one most people picture when they imagine a war between nations, and it is exactly the kind of power that is far harder to fully switch off, even after its most advanced tools have already been destroyed. One more thing before we get to how all of this actually settles. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding conflicts like this one properly, instead of skimming a headline and moving on. So do me a favor and hit subscribe if you have not already, because stories like this one, stories that connect years of quiet military planning to the headlines you see today, are exactly what this channel is built around, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Stepping back from the individual strikes, the statements, and the footage, what stands out most about this entire story is not really the explosions, it is the idea itself. A nation living under heavy sanctions, without the industrial base to build a real aircraft carrier or a conventional navy, found a way to hide a ballistic missile battery inside what looked like ordinary shipping containers, and sailed it out in plain sight for nearly 3 years before it was finally discovered and destroyed. Whether you see that as a genuinely clever piece of asymmetric strategy or as a reckless gamble that ended with 2 of Iran's most expensive naval assets wiped out within days of a war beginning depends entirely on how you weigh deterrence against exposure. And that question matters far beyond Iran, because somewhere else in the world right now, another country is almost certainly looking at what happened at that port and asking itself the exact same question. Can we hide something valuable in plain sight? And will anyone notice before it is too late? History suggests the answer is rarely as simple as either side hopes. A disguise can work for years, quietly, patiently, surviving satellite passes and intelligence reports and years of careful engineering. But the moment someone finally looks closely enough in the right place at the right time, all of that patience can collapse in an instant. 3 years of secrecy, hundreds of engineers, and a strategy built on outsmarting the world's most advanced militaries can disappear in a single burning morning at a port most people had never even heard of a week earlier. That is the real story, hiding underneath the missiles and the drones and the ships. Not just who won this particular exchange, but how easily even the most carefully hidden power can vanish the instant it is finally seen. Every disguise, no matter how clever, is a bet that no one will look closely enough for long enough, and at exactly the right moment, Iran lost that bet. The ships that took years to build were gone in less than 3 days, and the door they were meant to hold open for Iran's navy quietly closed behind them. If you made it this far, you understand this story better than almost anyone still watching the headlines and moving on. So leave one final thought before you go. Tell me whether you think this kind of hidden weapon strategy is still worth the risk after everything you just learned, and I will see you in the next one.